Jared Bendis, so delightful to be back with you after years and years of nearly worshiping at your feet for all the brilliance and wisdom that you bring to education and creativity. As I said before we start taping, your bio is so extensive that rather than mess it up, I'm going to ask you to give us a brief thing that you think people about to listen to this conversation need to know about you to understand where you're coming from.
So I wear two main hats and then lots of little hats. So unlike everyone else, I have two full-time jobs. So I am the creative new media officer for the Calvin Smith Library at Case Western Reserve University, where I set vision for and help maintain and run the Friedman Center for Digital Scholarship, which is a computer lab, but it's more than a computer lab. It's a digital scholarship center. So I'm one of the experts people call on when they're going, I've got a vision for an X. How do I make this happen without breaking the bank? And that could be a research thing. It could be an educational thing. We do have an educational in ed tech division through our technology department. I'm not part of that, but for 12 years, I was part of that division. So my background really comes from there. I am also an adjunct at Case Western. I've been an adjunct in a bunch of departments. At one point, I started instructional technology, which meant that I was teaching instructional technology to future teachers. And I actually would teach them what I would joke would be, and we'll get to it in a moment, the one question that will make you stand out on every job interview, I guarantee. And then all of those courses went by the wayside, but the only class I'm teaching at Case Western right now is I teach for the Cognitive Sciences department, which is like a dream department to teach for. And either I teach cognition and gaming or cognition and virtual reality. And then the other big hat that I wear is over at the Cleveland Institute of Art, where I've been an adjunct for probably around a decade. I was recently appointed as associate professor and chair of the game design department. So I'm full-time faculty across the street. Luckily, it's because of the pandemic that everyone realizes that there's flexible schedules and overlaps and that things aren't done when you think they're done. That allows me to have these two full-time jobs. I'm full-time staff at Case Western and I'm full-time faculty at the Cleveland Institute of Art. And game design is really about experience design, which goes back to what we do in education.
Thank you, Jared. So to get to the essence of what we're talking about in this whole project, put yourself please back in the frame of mind for March 2020, for better or for worse, and talk about what you were doing that was transitional from how people were learning up to that moment and how the pandemic affected what you do as a teacher and a learning facilitator.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I was teaching some courses that would be almost impossible to teach online. So let's talk about teaching virtual reality remotely without any technology. And teaching virtual reality in a pandemic would be very, very difficult. And for some strange, bizarre reason that no one quite knows, I ended up front loading all my demos. For some reason, I just told my students, you know what, we're just going to have like party, and then we'll write the end towards the end of the semester. So we had done all the hands-on demos in my one academic classes before we moved on to research, writing, and talking. So in some ways, everyone was like, well, that was convenient. What are you going to do next year? And I'm like, I don't know. The other course that I was teaching, the other big course that I teach is Intro to Video Game Design. And Intro to Video Game Design is one of the easiest courses to teach remotely. Like it's a no-brainer for me to teach that remotely. So in one class, I was blessed. And in the other class, it was just a good timing. The thing that was weird for me during the pandemic was I had come back from the Consumer Electronics Show in early January. And so every year I go to the Consumer Electronics Show. And when we were all in the airport, we were all sick as dogs. And it's not uncommon when you're at a trade show to get sick. Matter of fact, several years earlier, I'd gotten influenza A and almost wasn't able to come home because of my fever. But this was weird. Everyone was sick. And even in the press, and if you look at it up now, you can go back and people were calling it the CES flu because people were noticing how many people in the airport were sick in early January. And there's a possibility that that may have been one of the initial super spreader events that we don't even talk about. And because I've never gotten sick during this entire time. And I'm the primary caregiver for my household, which is really weird because I'm the one who was out every day doing all the things. I was the conduit and I never got sick with COVID. But it could have also been that maybe I'd had it in January.
How were you dealing with Grace before the pandemic, and how are you dealing with it now? The real underlying question here is how much was online and face-to-face in both these settings?
Well, I think one of my favorite examples was I was teaching a summer course that went virtual. I saw a couple of summer courses that went virtual that normally had never been virtual before, but I think in some ways the school was like, hey, this is even better. We'll have more students because we don't get a lot of summer students. And there was this one student, and when he logged in, he looked just so bleary-eyed. And I'm like, what's going on? He's like, it's 4 o'clock in the morning here in China. And I'm like, oh my God, you got up for a 4 a.m. course? He goes, no, I just got out of my 1 a.m. course. And I'm like, oh my God, like, because he's half a world away. And every time I would make the assignments for the week, I would ask myself, does this need to be synchronous? Can I make more content asynchronous? And every time I would record a lecture instead of have the class, I would think of that one kid getting a good night's sleep. And that was me thinking about somebody else in a sort of different way. And that actually was a direct effect. Literally started thinking about asynchronous education a little bit more because that one guy was getting up at 4 a.m. to come to my class. The other side of this about asynchronous versus synchronous communication is how much I'm more aware of the neurodivergent community. And that's partly because I spend a lot of time on TikTok where there's a huge neurodivergent community. And I've understood more about, I've always taught students that were neurodivergent, but I've come to a greater understanding about some of the needs, not because of my educational work, just because of my friends and colleagues online. And with that, I'm finding that the more I record evergreen lectures, or the more I'm willing to record my own Zoom lectures and then post them, the more that students who were even in the room are going to watch them again.
That is another topic that we really haven't addressed all that much so far, and are we there yet? Neurodivergency. What were you doing before, and what adaptations have you had to make beyond what you just talked about in terms of your lectures?
Well, I think part of it is obviously we are now dealing with a stunted uh, socio emotional intelligence. Like the students that are coming in now, it's as if they skipped high school in terms of maturity. So we are dealing with little kids in adult bodies who do not know how to private interpersonal communications. And so I have to deal with that a little bit. And it used to be like, yeah, catch up, but it's not catch up. It's actually across the board. Kids these days is not just a get off my lawn sort of thing. Kids these days, when we joke about the amount of anxiety, and I don't mean this from a microaggression perspective, we joke about this is the anxiety generation. But if you take a step back, if you stop looking at it from your own perspective, if you take a step back, you realize this is the anxiety generation. Can you imagine? I mean, we've had episodes in our lives, but they've always been like episodes. Their entire fabric of their existence is based on growing up during a plague. And, I always think to myself about, yesterday was 9/11. And I think about, when the pandemic hit, there will be no, hopefully, greater touchstone moment in these students' lives that directly affect them as much as this. This is their Great War. This is their World War II. I don't even think we have even and again, 9/11 would be the closest big slap in the face. The world is now different. But like it affected me, but it didn't affect me as much as the pandemic has. And for us to bounce through the pandemic, for us to sit here going, we are adults, we were going to survive, we're going to craft the world around us. But for these children, and I mean children, to grow up in a world of fear and isolation in this generation, this will forever be what they talk about. There's no way of escaping this. Not for us, we'll probably lament, what did you do during lockdown? That's not how they're going to talk about it. That's not how they're going to talk about it. It isn't lockdown for them. It's like there was this part of my childhood and it's gone.
You clearly, for anybody watching this in its entirety, understands at this point, you have so much heart. Using that heart and using that educational brilliance you have, what are the best things you have done that you would share with people in addressing what you just laid out?
The thing that's interesting is you spend a lot of time becoming a moderator. You end up a lot of time becoming a counselor. For a lot of people, they come to class, they teach their materials, and they leave again. And yeah, I probably bring, too much heart to the situation, but I think it warrants it. There's always been the big divide between high school and college. the K-12 movement is no child left behind, and the higher ed movement is here's a rope, here's enough rope, do what you're going to do with it. And that becomes a really big challenge because, again, I can't give out extra credit. It's against our mandate to give out extra credit. And people are like, no, it isn't. Check your numbers. It probably is. Everyone has to be given the same exact opportunity. If you give extra credit to one student, you have to give that opportunity to all students. We're contractually bound to give the same opportunity to everyone. And so equity becomes a very strange and limiting factor in higher ed, while in K-12, it's like, no, it's all about just getting people to pass whatever the cost. So now we're at this hybrid point where I'm needing to not violate my own rule set, because again, we do have these rules that are put upon us. And for those who are like, oh, we do what we do, that's great, but I need to think about this from an enterprise perspective. I need to think that anything I do needs to be able to scale. I talk to a lot of weird educational theorists. Many years ago, I knew a guy who refused to give a syllabus to his students because he liked to evolve it over the semester, and everyone praised him for it. And I'm like, that's not praiseworthy. I'm sorry. The syllabus is a contract between the student and the university. They have to be on file for our crediting organizations. Like, you can say that there's kinder and gentler things you do for your students, but let's be practical. There are things that you need to do that may work for you, but it doesn't work for the next guy who happens to be a jerk, who doesn't turn into syllabus, and the students are lost. Like, do not take your own personality and think that that somehow transcends the system that we're trying to do as well. So I work really, really hard to make sure the things I do are systemically valid so that people can learn from them and do them themselves, not just, oh, Jared's a nice guy, so it works for him, it doesn't work for the next guy. And I think that becomes challenging for us because I spend more time with my students than maybe others do. And at the same time, I've got to draw these lines and say, you are responsible for these things. But what the biggest thing that we're doing is that everything gets scaled down. Everything has been scaled down. The amount of content that we can give people is less now. You have to embrace the fact that you need to scale back the content. So one last thing before I end this question is, I teach game design. So the big thing about game design is that people always go, what do you learn from games? And I have a whole course on serious game design. And the reality of it is you don't learn anything from games. And the reason is that in games is informal education, and higher education is formal education. And in formal education, you learn content, and in informal education, you learn process. And how much we are teaching is generally content. And now, because of these other factors, we end up becoming process teachers as well. And if you aren't aware of how much you become a methodology teacher, the methodologies that they should have learned growing up through K-12. So now we need to incorporate methodologies as part of it. So we need to scale back our content so that we can raise them through methods. Because if we only get them through content and we don't get them through methods, then it's memorization and there's no lifelong learning.